How y'all doing? So here we are. This is week 4, and I didn't want to let this summer session end without without me taking some time to address the issues going on right now in the world, in particular the issue of Black Lives Matter, um, and trying to make that connection between the role of science and from a scientific standpoint, I should say, make the connection with the struggle for Black Lives Matter. Now, I labored over this lesson a lot because I really wanted to present this information clearly, accurately, and concisely, and responsibly also. So what I'm going to do is I don't want to make it confusing or convoluted, but what I'm going to do is basically kind of do this in 2 parts. The first part is going to be talking about reviewing the actual science, the biology, which is the study of life, the stuff that I feel like is very important that relates to the issue in our theme of Black Lives Matter. And then the second part is I'm going to make some connections with that science to what we're experiencing right now in our country and what we have been experiencing in our country throughout history. All right. Um, so without further ado, let me go ahead and get it started here. So all living things, right, have genetic material, genes, right? DNA. They all have DNA, right? And we talked about the 3 domains. These are the broad domains of life, right? We talked about the archaea. All of these are unicellular, meaning all of these organisms are just made up one cell. And yes, they have DNA. Their DNA is in like a little ring, right? That's just floating around inside of the cell, right? We talked about bacteria. These are the extremophiles, by the way. Archaea are the extremophiles. We talked about bacteria, right? And bacteria also single cell organisms, meaning each organism is just one cell, right? All the different species, right, in this domain are one cell. And yes, they have, let me go back. Yes, they have DNA, right? They have DNA, right? Genetic material, right? And finally, last but not least, of course, is eukarya, right? Now, what makes these special is that, yes, they have DNA just like these two, but their DNA is, for lack of a better word, a little bit more sophisticated. It lives in, and their DNA is kept inside of a nucleus, right? So if you could imagine, like if you think about an egg, the nucleus would kind of be like the yolk, right? That's floating inside there. And the DNA is kept protected inside the cell, inside of the nucleus, right? Right here, eukarya, right? That's what makes any organism eukaryotic. These are eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic because they have a nucleus, right? All right. So eukaryotes, right? Organisms that have a nucleus inside of their cell, and inside of their nucleus is the DNA, right? What type of organisms are these? Well, fungi, right? Which are, there are some single cell fungi like yeast, but most of the fungi are multicellular, right? Meaning made up of many cells, right? You have plants, right? And all the different type of plants that you could imagine, you could think of, right? Also eukaryotic, meaning their DNA is also inside of a nucleus. This you have so all the plants you have, and they're all multicellular. All plants are multicellular. You have these things down here. These are protists. They're like single-celled organisms, but even though they're single-celled, like the bacteria and the archaea, they're still in the eukaryotes because those cells have a nucleus, right? And the DNA is inside the nucleus. So this is a amoeba. This is a paramecium, right? Those are examples. Microscopic. Like you would find this in like pond water, like microscopic. And some of these paramecium don't do anything harmful to humans, but there are some species of amoeba that do cause disease, right? So, in humans, but like I said, they're still eukaryotic, right? Their cells have a nucleus inside it. And then, of course, all the animals. I only put two here. I put a raccoon, which to represent the mammals, and I put a goldfish to represent the fish. But all of them. I'm talking about the birds too. I'm talking about humans, us, right? Which we're mammals too. I'm talking about the worms, the insects, the spiders. Every single animal that you could think of also falls under the eukaryotic, meaning all the cells inside of the spider, all the cells inside of the insect have a nucleus, and the nucleus has the DNA contained inside of it. All right, but what is DNA? All right, so DNA is a very complex chemical, right, that is found in the cells of all organisms, right? And an organism, all an organism is a living thing, and you can kind of see here. And what do they mean by complex? Like this looks pretty complex, right? Well, what do they mean by that? A complex chemical found in organisms, right? And here you can kind of see if you are fans of the Big Bang Theory, you see a model of it often whenever these guys are talking or doing things in their apartment. This is a model of the DNA molecule. And here it is too, with Obama pointing at it too, right? A model of the DNA molecule. So all a molecule is two or more atoms bonded together chemically, right? So you have simple molecules like carbon dioxide and water, right? Where you have two atoms of hydrogen bonded to one atom of oxygen, right? This is just a little bit of chemistry, but so that y'all could get the context, right? And this is kind of like the shape of it. This is the model of it. And here you have carbon dioxide, right? You have one atom of carbon in the middle, the black one, and then you have two atoms of oxygen, these red ones on the end, right? So you have simple molecules, right? And you also have complex molecules. So DNA is a very complex molecule, right? So you see here are the atoms that are in DNA. You have hydrogen, just like you do with water. You have oxygen, just like you do over here. You have carbon, but you also have nitrogen and phosphorus. But it's the way these things combine, right? So the thing about this is it is a very complex molecule. And what's crazy is this is just one part of it. This is just one part. This actually goes on like on and on and on. It's very it's like huge. It's like long. Like if you were to stretch out somebody's DNA, it could like go from here to the sun like a few times. It's like that, like long. It's really thin, but it's that long. This spiral. All right. So DNA, being a complex molecule, is called a macromolecule, which is a molecule that is made up of simpler molecules, right? That's what makes it so, complex looking, right? So the simpler molecules that make DNA are the base pairs, and these are the base pairs right here, these colors right here: thymine, cytosine, adenine, guanine, right? These are the base pairs, and you also have the phosphate sugar backbone, right? And so here is represented just in gray, but this is actually a long molecule, a bunch of little molecules uh, that are stuck together that make the backbone of the DNA, and then the base pairs stick out there. And it's interesting because the name of DNA stands for ribonucleic acid, deoxyribose, like glucose or like fructose or like lactose. There's just a type of sugar, right, that makes the backbone. Okay. And a sugar in itself is a macromolecule, or can be a macromolecule when you talk about like complex carbohydrates, right? But in this case, we're just, let's just focus on DNA. And actually, I do want to focus on one more type of molecule. DNA is a macromolecule, and that's important to life. There are others also, like I mentioned, carbohydrates. They're also macromolecules, and lipids, which make the membranes, which are like fats and oils. They're also considered macromolecules. But today, I just want to focus on DNA, and I want to focus on the other important macromolecule, which is proteins. All right. A protein is also another kind of macromolecule, right? And so remember, macromolecule are molecules that are made up of smaller molecules that come together. In the case of proteins, where in it's the smaller molecules are different amino acids, right? And I know we've heard about these things when we talk about like food and amino acids. You go to get you want to lift weights and stuff. You might hear these they'll advertise products with amino acids in there, and amino acids are important because proteins are super important. All right. So proteins, they do so many different jobs in our bodies, right? And they're important because DNA, the code of DNA, what it is doing, what it codes for is for the creation of proteins. But let's take a look at what we got here about proteins. So the shape of a DNA molecule, right, is the double helix, right, which is the twisted staircase, right, and it's twisted up inside of prokaryotic cells like bacteria or in archaea, and it's also twisted up inside of eukaryotic cells in the nucleus, right. So with proteins, they don't have that same shape. Actually, proteins have different shapes because the shape of the protein relates to its function, meaning its job. So here we have a lot of different type of proteins, right? So tendons, which are like your that connect your joints, and cartilage, like your kneecap or your ear, things like that. Hair, these are all proteins. Nails, your muscles, right, which make you move and make other animals move. These are also proteins, right? Hemoglobin in your blood, which transports oxygen, is also a protein, right? These are all different types of proteins that have different types of shapes for their job, to do their job, right? Here are two important ones too. Hormones like insulin. Insulin is also a protein, right? And growth hormones are also proteins, right? um, and enzymes, which are very important because they make all the chemical reactions happen, like breaking down your food into different, into breaking down your food so that your body can process it. That's all enzymes doing that. That's a big part of what they do. But they have a lot of other functions too that are way more complex. But the point I want to make here is these proteins, the way these proteins get made in your body is by the DNA, right? The DNA, these codes, these nitrogen bases are the codes that are the instructions for what protein to make when and where, right? So that's the connection between DNA and proteins is very important. So, in talking about proteins, you might ask yourself, well, hey, if my DNA makes proteins, why are they always saying that I got to eat foods with proteins in it, right? So, and that would be logical for you to think, right? If every one of your cells is making proteins, why do I need to eat proteins, right? Why doesn't my body just make it? Well, not all proteins are the same, and also your body takes the proteins that you eat, it breaks it down into those amino acids, and then it kind of like rebuilds it in the protein that it needs, right? So you eat like some chicken and there's all these proteins inside the chicken, right? It goes into your stomach, you break it down, it breaks down that proteins into amino acids. Then your body will take those amino acids from that chicken that you ate, and it'll rebuild it to make muscle or rebuild it to make hemoglobin, whatever it needs, right? So that's just a simple way for you to understand that. But but your DNA is what's giving the instruction for the rebuild. You understand? So that's what that is. So we've talked about DNA. Now let's talk about chromosomes. Now, as I mentioned, the DNA molecule is so like long, right? It's so long. Uh, so in order for it to fit inside your cell, right, it gets like kind of like bundled up into these chromosomes, right? And human beings have 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? Altogether, 46 chromosomes, 23 from mom, 23 from dad, right? 23 from the sperm, 23 from the egg. Um, so what it is what chromosomes, it makes it easier to kind of like manage the information in your DNA, right? So we've talked about what a genome is. A genome is all the chromosomes in the organism. So for us, our genome is made up of these 23 pairs. Or another way to say it is our genome is made up of 46 chromosomes, right? Now, our genome represents the whole encyclopedia set, all that information, right? Now, the chromosomes represent like one book in the encyclopedia set, which makes sense because it's so much information. How are you going to manage it? Like, what if this whole encyclopedia set was one book? You like couldn't like even open it. Like, how huge would that book be? It wouldn't even work, right? So they break it up into volumes, just like your body breaks up your chromosome, your DNA into chromosomes, right? What is a gene? Okay. All a gene is one particular part of the DNA. So this is your DNA. Remember, it goes on like forever. So the DNA, and it's coiled up inside of the chromosome, right? A gene is just one little part, right? And what it is a set of instructions. Really, it's just a order or a pattern in this code of the bases to create a particular protein that controls a trait. So what am I saying? What am I saying? Look right here. This is the way to kind of look at it. Here you got your genome. Your genome is all the DNA inside of an organism, right? All of your DNA. Let's say if we're talking about a human being, all of the DNA inside of a human being, right? We know that the genome is so huge it has to get broken down into chromosomes, right? Chromosomes are the different volumes in the encyclopedia, right? And now a gene, the DNA is wrapped up inside this chromosome. A gene is just a particular segment of that DNA. And what that gene does is it creates a particular protein to do a particular job, right? So let's say, for instance, on this chromosome, you have a part here that a part of the DNA code that controls hair color, right? Now, since you get a chromosome from the egg and a chromosome from the sperm, right? You might have they have to line up. They have to match up. So hair color is going to be on the same place in each one from one parent, from the egg and from the sperm, right? So hair color, right? But it might not be the same exact gene. It might be like it's the same place, but there might be a little twist in the code, like maybe one of the letters is changed. So it might not be the exact same code, but it is the exact same gene in the sense of what it's responsible for, what protein is responsible for making, right? So that's when you get into this idea of genotype, which are the genes that you have, and phenotype, which are the physical traits that are expressed, right? So that's what that's about. But a gene is just, so one chromosome has a whole bunch of different genes on it, okay? And like I said, they're in pairs based on how we reproduce. We're sexual organisms, meaning we get half of our chromosomes from the male or the sperm and half of the chromosome from the egg, right? And that's how it works with sexual reproduction. There is asexual reproduction, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into that right now. But so now let's continue forward. Every species on the earth has its own genome, right? Has its own genome. So here are some examples. right? So this is a roundworm. A roundworm has its own genome, has its own, like, all the genes that are in its cells. It's a eukaryotic organism, right? It has its nucleus. It has a DNA in its nucleus, and it has 4 chromosomes, right? This is rice. Rice is an organism, right? It's a plant, right? And rice is a eukaryotic organism. All its DNA is in its nucleus, right? And it has 24. And here we are. We have 46, right? 46 chromosomes. Chimpanzees have 48. Look, dogs have 78 chromosomes, right? That's how that works. And then you might be familiar with how people scientists use these are their scientific names, is a way just to distinguish the different species on Earth, right? And our scientific name, right, is Homo sapien, right? So um and then here are so those are the chromosomes of the genome, and then here is the genome. So what this is telling you is how many genes make up the genome, right? How many different traits are being controlled or whatever in DNA. So a bacteria has 4,200. Take a look at these numbers here. So bacteria has 4,200 genes, right? And let's look at the ones here so that we can make a comparison. Let's compare these real quick. So humans have 46 chromosomes, right? But we have approximately 21,000 different genes, okay, on those chromosomes. All right. 21,000 different little segments of the DNA that create proteins, right? That we need to make us what we are, right? Look at rice. Rice has 24 chromosomes, but look, it has approximately 38,000 genes that make rice what it is, right? Now, the key thing I want y'all to notice from this here is that it doesn't matter the complexity of the organism, right? It doesn't matter the size of the organism, right? This it doesn't matter because rice has less chromosomes than humans, but rice has more genes than humans, right? Or look at this water flea. Water fleas are microscopic, super small, way smaller than humans, but they have more genes than us, right? So you can't have that in your head thinking that, like, oh, it's a worm, it's little, it only has 4. It doesn't work like that, right? It doesn't work like that. Okay, nature just doesn't work like that. All right. So what is a species? I'm talking about species here. What is a species, right? Well, a species is organisms. Organisms are considered the same species if they can successfully create fertile offspring. What does that mean? That means that the parents can make a baby, and that baby can make babies, right? Now, whether it decides to reproduce or whether it survives to reproduction age, it doesn't matter, but it has the potential to make offspring, to make more babies, correct? It can do it genetically, right? That's how you know a species, right? So let's look at something. Let's go back real quick and let's look at something, okay? So you know something is from the same species if they can create offspring that is fertile, right? And it actually makes sense because if you think about it, let's look at a chimpanzee and let's look at a dog, right? If you took a chimpanzee and tried to mate it with a dog, first of all, you see here the chromosomes won't line up. First of all, there's is the offspring. I mean, how many chromosomes would the offspring have? You remember, it has to be a match. We have 46 because we get half of them from the egg and half of them from the sperm, right? And that's the case in all of these organisms, right? Except the bacteria, which it reproduces in a different way. I'm not going to get into that here, but so this you couldn't get a match here, right? If things are two different species, right? If it's two different species, there's no way you could create offspring from there, right? Now, we do have cases in nature, right? And both of these are mammals, right? So, but we do have cases in nature, right, where we have these things called hybrid organisms, where we can get a offspring, right? So I don't know if y'all ever watched that movie Napoleon Dynamite, which is real funny, but this is a liger, right? So liger, what it is the crossing, right, or the breeding, a sperm from a male lion and an egg from a female tiger, right, and that creates a liger. Um, now, now it turns out because lions and tigers are so similar to each other because they are both cats, and I know I haven't discussed families, but as far as the evolution is concerned, like you could tell that a lion and a tiger they have the same ancestor, right? Um, so their genes are a lot of their genome is probably very very similar, right? And a lot of so a lot of the genes and the things probably match up because they're so kind of close, but they are different species. They've drifted apart through evolution, through generations of being separated, right? They've evolved into two different species that they can no longer successfully breed and create an offspring that itself is fertile, right? So this is a hybrid organism. And what happens with a lot of these hybrid organisms, that's what you get. If you get two things that are very close to each other genetically, similar, they might be able to breed, they might be able to breed, they might be able to conceive something and have an offspring, but that offspring will not be able to reproduce, right? And that's what you have here. A liger cannot breed with a tiger. It cannot breed with a lion. It cannot breed with another liger. It just is sterile, right? Same thing with a mule, right? The mule is the offspring of a male donkey and a female horse, right? And like they're so close again, their genomes are so similar, but they're different enough to make them distinctive, right? So that they're close enough to create offspring, but this offspring it cannot. But this offspring is infertile, so they've already split into different species, right? So, um, so what does that mean? So now let's talk about race. So now that I've laid that groundwork, I want to talk about race. I got to talk about it, right? Because that's the point of what I was getting at with this right here, right? Let's talk about this concept of race, okay? Now, it's natural for us as human beings to want to group things into categories, right? We organize things into categories to make it easier for us to understand and for us to deal with, right? So, I love this example here. So, when you go into the grocery store and you look at where they sell the produce, right? You see all these, and these are all different species, because each one of these represents a different species, right? Like a pineapple is a different species of plant than a watermelon, right? And a banana, those are different species of plants. These are all different species of plants. And, we've, based on how we, what we want to make it convenient for us, okay, we lined them up, group them together based on how they look, right? Based on what we know about, their flavor and things like that, right? Um, if you were to kind of look at the genome, maybe you would reorganize it completely different. You know what I mean? Like you would reorganize these fruits into different categories based on their genome. But for us, to make it easier for us, we took a look at the traits that it had. We looked at the color. We looked at what we've called the fruit, the flavor, or whatever, and we've lined them up, right? We did that for us, and humans did that. Nature doesn't really do that. Okay? Like compared to this fruit stand, right? All of these represent different plants, right? Compared to this fruit stand, look at this forest, right? And of course, here you're looking at all this green tangled mess. Now, these are different plants, right? They probably have different, they bear fruits. Some of them probably bear fruits, but they have different seasons. They're not all, blooming at the same time, right? So nature has its own rules and ways of organizing life, right? The rainforest looks like a mess, but nature has its own logic and system of organization that is challenging for us to understand, but it works perfectly fine for nature, right? So it has an underpinning of a system, right? Of why does this plant grow low? Why do these trees grow high? Why do these vines? That it has its own kind of way that we are asked to study, right? That we study in biology. Now, as humans, we like when things look like this, right? It's convenient for us to categorize things like this, right? But nature is like this, all right? So let's take this let's look at some people here. So look at these lovely ladies here. Some of these faces you may be familiar with. So, if all of these ladies were in a room talking and mingling or whatever, you would look at them. Now, in your brain, you might want to categorize them like this, right? Like in your head, you would say, okay, well, these three ladies are black ladies, right? These are white ladies, and these are Latinas. And I guess maybe depending on where you fall, maybe you might line them up with these ladies or line them up in the middle. I put them in the middle. You know what I mean? But you want to categorize these into three ladies for whatever reason, right? And that's kind of like what society has done, right? Like, all right, so when you look at these two ladies here, you have Gwyneth Paltrow here, and you have Janelle Monáe. You say, okay, Gwyneth Paltrow is a white woman, Janelle Monáe is a black woman, right? Now, remembering what we talked about in the sense of both of these, so they're human beings. So in their genome, both of these genomes, right? We have 46 chromosomes. Gwyneth has 46 chromosomes. Janelle has 46 chromosomes, right? And 2,100 traits, 21,000 traits. 21,000 traits. Gwyneth has 21,000 traits. Janelle has 21,000 traits. If you were to take a guess of how many of those chromosomes or how many of those genes, let's put it that way, how many of those 21,000 genes, right? What percentage of that would you think would be different between Gwyneth and Janelle, between a white woman and a black woman? I'll let you think about that. Of the 21,000 genes that each of these ladies have, what percentage of those genes do you think would be different based on the fact that Gwyneth is white and Janelle is black? Well, it turns out that of those 21,000 genes, only 0.5% of those genes. And I did the math earlier. That's like maybe like 100 genes, right? Maybe around there. 0.5%. That's less than 1%, right? The differences that you see between this white woman and this black woman, those differences are caused by less than 1%, by 0.5% of the genome, of the genes. I'm going to let that sink in. We have been talking about black and white people for how long now in this country? And it turns out the science says that 99% of all human beings have the same genes, right? In fact, and we like to group people, right? We're grouping people. These are white women. These are black women. And we group them. So you put them in a group because these are similar, right? And you put these in a group because they're similar. It turns out there's more difference between, there's more genetic difference within a racial group. So within these black women right here, there's more genetic differences than there is between the white woman, the black woman, and the white woman, right? Same here, actually, too. I'm gonna let that sink in. Okay. It turns out that like scientists now um, are all in agreement that human beings began in Africa and the African continent itself, right? That we know black people came from Africa, right? The whole African continent, which is the second largest continent on the earth, right? This continent has the most genetic diversity than any place on earth, right? Meaning Africans are very different from each other. We want to group them all as black people, right? But they're actually very, very different from each other genetically. Okay. So that makes me start thinking about so all human beings belong to the same species, and that species is Homo sapien. All right. And you know that all human beings belong to the same species because remember what I said the definition of species was? I'll go back to that slide. A species is what? Species are organisms are considered the same species if they can successfully create fertile offspring, right? So let's think about this, right? We know that black people and white people are the same species because hello, it's a million people that we love in our and people in our families who like are quote unquote biracial, right? Like my dear brother Ethan, right? Those of you open students, I love my brother Ethan. His father is black, quote unquote black. His mother is quote unquote white, and Ethan has like comes from a big family, has a lot of brothers and sisters, and he himself, right, created two beautiful daughters, right? So like, you know, I bring this up because um uh I bring this up because it's going to get to a point to why this whole issue between black and white is so important, okay? So now we're going to go down into a deeper moment here. Okay. So race is not a scientifically valid concept. It is not natural and objective. It is based on how people categorize people to make it convenient, right? For the people doing the categorizing. Let's go back. Remember the fruit stand? It's convenient for us to have these things organized like this. But if you were to take a banana, maybe a banana wouldn't grow next to a pear well, right? Because nature has its own rules that it follows, right? So let's bring it back up here. All right. So that's what they mean when they say race is a socially constructed concept. If you've heard that before, people created the idea of race to serve a purpose. Oh, let me not jump to that yet. So let's look right here now. So now, if you look here, this is the Human Genome Project. These are this is when has a tech, because people have recently done the human genome. This is their definition of race. Race is a fluid concept used to group people according to various factors, including ancestral background and social identity. Race is also used to group people that share a set of visible characteristics, such as skin color and facial features. Though these visible traits are influenced by genes, the vast majority of genetic variation exists within racial groups and not between them. Race is an ideology, and for this reason, many scientists believe that race should be more accurately described as a social construct, not a biological construct, right? But unfortunately, this is a realization, this is a modern realization, right? So if race is a social construct, hold on, hold on. I don't want to jump the gun here. So race is a social construct. Why is there racism? Right? Why is racism still lingering? Right? If this is the modern scientific with the evidence to back it and the science to back it, why is it still an issue? Right? Why Black Lives Matter? Well, I guess we got to go back to these guys, right? The founding fathers. So now this is where it kind of drips a little bit out of science and starts going into history a little bit. But I have to make this point because I want y'all to understand this clearly. Okay. These founding fathers, we know the story of the 13 colonies that rebelled against Britain, descendant of the Pilgrims, right? That came and landed on Plymouth Rock, and they left Europe because they were escaping religious persecution, right? Uh, that's the story or whatever. The main point I want to say about this, what we know about these founders, and we know about Europeans, white descendants of Europeans, white people in America and in Europe, they were they're Christian nations, right? Their religion is Christianity. Now, in Spain, it was Catholic. In England, there's all different, there's a whole history with that. But the point I want to make is that they were Christian nations, right? And here's Columbus, right? Holding the cross, right? Doing what he did in the name of Christ, supposedly, but not really. But, that's up for debate. No, it's not actually. It's not up for debate. But right, so they were Christian country, Christian country. They're a Christian religion, right? All the Europeans, the Spanish, the English, all of them, the Americans, right? And what is the ultimate? What is the most esteemed? What is the sacred text of Christianity? It's the Bible, right? So I want to point your attention, and the Bible is still super important. Look, presidents swear on it when they take their oath, right? A Bible. When you're in court, you put your hand on it, swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God, with my hand on the sacred text, the Bible, right? And, even this dude felt like it was important enough to bring out for his photo op. So the Bible is still very important, right? So in the Bible, the most holy text, in the first book, Genesis is the first book. In the first chapter of the book, the first chapter, right? Verse 26, it says, let's read it, okay? This is what it says, the highest book respected by Europeans, the sacred text. It says, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over, let's look at the list, the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move upon the ground. Notice in this very specific list from the sacred text, God did not say or did not include, let them rule over another man or let them rule over other humans, right? Or, man, which, man and woman, right? Curiously is omitted from here. But the point I'm trying to make is it was very specific. It didn't say anything about ruling over another man. It said fish of the sea, birds of the sky, livestock and wild animals, and the creatures that move along the ground. Okay? A man is not mentioned in that list. Let's look at this document right here. The Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776, right? That the founding fathers created. This beautiful document with these beautiful ideas that ring so true to us, right? It says here in this document, it wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed with their creator with certain unalienable rights, meaning certain rights that you can't take away from them, right? Certain rights that inherent rights, and they put a capital R, right? Uh, and among those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, meaning governments are created by people and they get their power from the people, right? To secure the rights, right? That's what a government is supposed to do: secure the rights of the people, of the citizens, right? That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, meaning it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form has to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Meaning the government is supposed to protect our rights, our unalienable rights. And if it doesn't, the people of that government have the right to alter or abolish that government, to change it in order to affect their safety and happiness, right? All men are created equal. So now, this was 1776. This was written while this was happening. Slavery, black people were held in slavery in the southern states, right? That was happening at the same time, right? These Christian people, right, that will go to church on Sunday and they will read this Bible, and slavery was happening when they didn't have the right from God to rule over another person, right? So how do you justify, right? How do you justify slavery, right? With these two things in mind. The only way you can justify slavery is through dehumanization. You have to, all men are created equal. So how is it that you have slaves, Thomas Jefferson? Oh, black people aren't human. They're less than human. Dehumanization. You understand? Black people were reduced. We're the same species. No, black people are less than human. They were reduced to fit into this box of the livestock in order for the men, white men, to be able to rule over them, right? And just like livestock, less than human, they were packed in these slave ships like this, like a product. You know what I mean? Like as if they were like a product, like not living humans with souls and families and people that they loved, and just packed in there way over capacity, inhumane conditions, right? And um, and delivered and sold, right? And the sad thing is, science worked to justify. Science was like employed, and it really was pseudoscience, right? So they came up with the idea of race to legitimize the dehumanization. Did all kind of weird, crazy things like looking at people's skulls, craniology, if you want to look it up, it's all kind of stuff. But basically what it said, the whole concept of 5 races, that kind of came from this, like all this pseudoscience really is what it was. But at the time they tried to like legitimize the idea of dehumanization. Science played a part in that. The science said that, like, the white person, the European right here, was like the ultimate, the most evolved form of a human being, right? And that's not the case at all, right? That's not how that works, right? And actually, the white person is still part of, is still in the same, like trying to say that white people were a different species, right? But we know the definition of species right now, and we know that that is not true, right? Because obviously white people and black people can have fertile offspring. We're the same species, right? But like I said, it's a social construct that they created to justify the dehumanization. It's a social construct that was created to, make these people in church feel a little bit better about the way that they were treating these other human beings that were in their country, right? And make it possible for people to neglect, or to make it so that this document and the laws and things didn't apply to black people, right? They also had this thing here, right? The 3/5 compromise, right? Where basically they said that an African, a slave, a black person was 3/5 of a person, not a whole person, 3/5 of a person. So what that, and they did it for like taxation purposes and representation, but it ain't like the slaves could vote, right? But the rich southern plantation owners, you know, since they had all these people, they were trying to like get some credit. Like they didn't want to give them credit for being humans, but they wanted to get credit for, taxation or voting purposes, right? Like, man, it's so much, like, this is so whack. But 3/5, right? So 5 African slaves equals 3 white citizens or whatever, just for counting purposes, right? Dehumanization, right? And so now there's all this talk about, check out this, I get why they want to tear this statue down. So you got Theodore Roosevelt right here, on top of the horse, right? So that he's over all the 3 beasts, right? All the Native American who was less than a human, the horse who was less than a human, and the African who was less than a human, but he's a superior human sitting on top of that, right? Dehumanization. It's a physical representation of that, of lowering the status of the humanity of people of color, right? You also have, and I'm not going to get into it here, but if y'all want to look up human zoos right here, look up human zoos, man. In Belgium, they used to take different tribes from around the world and like have them in cages for people to look at and gawk at. Like, you know what I mean? Like they were animals, like they were less than human. I mean, it's super like here, I'll show you one of them right here, which really killed me. So this guy right here, Otabenga, right? They kept him in a human zoo. And if you read this right here, I'm not going to read it here, but I'm just going to briefly tell you, like they took him to the Brooklyn Zoo, no, excuse me, the Bronx Zoo. And this was like after, this was 1914, I think, or wait, when was it? I'm not sure, but this was early 1900s, right? They took him to the Bronx Zoo. They told him he would be taking care of elephants, but really he was an exhibit. So think about that. Yeah, so dehumanization, I mean, it's a lot. But I want to make a point though, like, the same way I could show this to you, right? I could show you about um this quote from the Bible, and I could show you the Declaration of Independence, and you could say like, whoa, that's not right to treat black people like that, right? Um, there were people back in that time that uh were, they're called abolitionists, right? And there were people back in that time who, who fought against that, the dehumanization, and wanted to free the slaves, right? Because they knew that that was like hypocritical, like to be like, all men are created equal, but you have, except for these people. Oh, but then you're gonna say that they're not men, but obviously they are men. You know what I mean? They're having children with white people, and that's a whole nother level of dehumanization, the way like, black women were raped and stuff. That's a whole nother thing. Um, but But there were people back then that were like, no, we need to abolish slavery because people who were Christian and people of faith, um, and so so like there was like there's this famous image right here, right, of this was the seal of an abolitionist society in England in 1787, and this is like, African man on his knees saying, am I not a man and a brother? It's like a rhetorical question, but it was like an image that was used to help white people at the time to look and see, like, look, that's not right how you're treating black people. It's kind of like how, well, yeah, it's like, and they use it to make pins and things like that. Like, it was like a cause back then, you know what I mean? And, uh, I just find it ironic, that same image, black men kneeling to be acknowledged as a person is it's like, it rings so crazy to me when you think about the NFL and Kaepernick. What was he kneeling for? Right? He was kneeling for a stop to police brutality. And the core of police brutality, right? Why can't they just uh, shoot black people down in the streets? Why can't they just kneel on George Floyd's neck like that for 8 minutes? If you don't, in your head, the psychology of that dehumanization, right, is still at work right now, right, in our country. And that is the whole reason why Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is trying to get us to see black people are human beings, right? And you think it sounds so silly. You think it sounds like, obviously they're human beings, right? But because of the history, when they talk about like institutional racism, that's all this business with 3/5 and these statues and using science to justify white supremacy around the world. You know what I mean? Like, those are real things in the world, and we're seeing the effects of it. And that's what's causing all that's the mentality. Like, in my head, I feel that, all right, the founding fathers had the opportunity to address it back then, but for whatever reason, they didn't have the will, they didn't have the heart, right? They basically like kicked the can down the road. They made the compromise. They could have dealt with it at the beginning, but they didn't, right? But they had those ideas in the Declaration of Independence, right? So there came a reckoning, and the reckoning was the Civil War, right? So the Civil War, that was a conflict that helped to remedy this issue, right? And recognize the lives of black people. But even in then, you have forces that opposed it. Like when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, the Southern states were, nah, we want to keep our slaves. Forces opposing it. During the Civil War, right? The South and the North fought against each other, right? Over this issue, right? The South lost, right? But they still, even when they lost, they did a lot of, like, if you look at the Reconstruction period, a lot of like the Jim Crow and the way they changed the laws, and then they created, like, they basically made, the 13th Amendment. If you were a criminal, so all black people were free, but if you broke a law or if you were deemed a criminal, you would lose your rights again. So that's like a whole nother thing. And I don't have enough to get into it, but like this, the Civil War, and forces fought against it. People fought to try to make America truly great by living up to those beautiful words and those ideas that Thomas Jefferson wrote of all men and women being created equal with their inalienable rights, right? To hold that true, to make that a reality in this country, forces forces fought against it, right? The Civil Rights era, right? Again, forces, Martin Luther King and all those people involved in the Civil Rights era, trying to, like, make those words true, that all men and women are created equal with unalienable rights. Because those are true ideas. Those are real, beautiful ideas, right? But it just wasn't a reality in the country. Forces fought against that, right? So I look at it like, you talk about like the Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation, right? I kind of look at it like that was like a physical battle for physical slavery, but it still was around in a different form. And then the civil rights was like, it's like a spiritual kind of thing. It was physical too, but like a spiritual thing, you know. But those ideas are still persisting because black people are getting killed by police in the streets, right? I'm a grown man and I'm a black man, and I don't do nothing but I ain't committing no crime. I'm a father, you know what I mean? I'm a teacher. I love my children. I love my family. I love my students. You know what I mean? But I know that by my appearance, when I walk in around, when I'm around a police officer, I understand that, like, you know, I'm a target, you know? And so here we are at this Black Lives Matter moment. And what the reason why I'm taking this time too is I want y'all to understand that, like, we get the opportunity in this time, right, to do what those founding fathers didn't have the heart to do, right? To me, that's what I think this is about. Let's really make, you know, all men and women created equal, right? And this is what it's meant. So when you are an ally, or when you are supporting Black Lives Matter, that, and you have an anti-racist stance, you are taking a stand to take down those bricks and to make America what it was really, really supposed to be, right? You're taking down the bricks of institutional racism. You're acknowledging, you're helping to erase the legacy of dehumanization of Black people, right? So when you say Black Lives Matter, that's what I feel it to be, and I know it to be, that's what that's about. And so stand up. The more you learn, this is a science class, right? The more you learn in history, science, and all that stuff, that's how you learn the truth. And when you know the truth, you speak the truth, right? So now that you can, if you ever hear anybody talking about like Black people and white people shouldn't be together, or they're different, well, you like, nah, we all the same species. You understand what I'm saying? Like, that is why it's so important. Because the world that we live in right now, you need to develop an understanding so that you're not taken advantage of. And you need to develop an understanding so that you can defend your rights, right?